right, so good evening, everybody. I'd like to welcome everyone here in attendance and those who are joining us online for our Lenten mission. If you don't know me, my name is Andy Senchak. I'm the seminarian assigned here at Our Lady of Perpetual Help. I'm filling in for Father Tim tonight. He had an obligation that's keeping him away. Can you hear me better there? Okay. So I'm Andy Senchak, a seminarian here at the parish, and filling in for Father Tim. So this Lent, we're presenting a series that the parish has put together. And so the title of it is From Death to Life. And this will be a look into how we as Catholics integrate science with faith. It's a topic that's near and dear to my heart and has always been important to me as a physician myself. And really it's one that all of us as Christians are called to consider because we're in an age, obviously, of increasing technology and rapid scientific advancement. So how do we make sense of that and put it in a context of our own Catholic faith? And really it's such an important name that's been assigned to this, death to life. So as we journey in these 40 days of Lent together, we recall the mission of Jesus to bring life out of death. Death is not just of the body, but also out of our own sin as well. So this is a very important subject, not only in general, but as we endeavor down Lent this time. So the series is going to take place each Tuesday over the next 3 weeks. It'll be at 7 p.m. here at St. Mary's, and our first speaker is Dr. Mark Saxon. He will be here for the first 2 talks, and then a different speaker for the third talk. And so I have the pleasure today of introducing Dr. Mark Saxon. He is the chair of the Department of Dental Anesthesiology at the University of Pittsburgh School of Dental Medicine. He's a member of a society called the Society of Catholic Scientists, which is a national organization, and he's a founding member of the Pittsburgh chapter here. And he has extensive experience in both clinical anesthesiology and also in pharmacology, which is the study of how drugs act upon our brain. He's also a parishioner here at Our Lady of Perpetual Help. So his talk tonight will be on a deeper look at near-death experiences with the physiology of death, the specific actions of drugs on the brain and memory. So please help me welcome Dr. Mark Saxon.
Good evening. Can everybody hear me in the back? We're okay? All right. Thank you for coming tonight, and it's a pleasure to be here and talk about a topic that I think is near and dear to all of our hearts, or at least something that we're drawn to out of curiosity, which is the topic of near-death experiences. So for our overall outline, what we'll be doing over the next 2 weeks is we're going to talk tonight first about the phenomena of a near-death experience. We're going to look at definition. What exactly is a near-death experience? We're going to want to know how these terms came to be, and also how do they compare to hallucinogens and drug-related events. And so that'll take up most of today. We'll want to look at the experiences, what people are really feeling, and what they've reported. Now next week, we're going to go a little more scientific because we'll be talking about the dying brain. And one of the explanations people sometimes offer is that these experiences are the result of chemical changes that occur in the brain during the process of death. And also some people think, well, we've also noticed some of the very similar experiences when people have drugs, anesthetic drugs, and psychedelic drugs. So it's like that. So we'll explore that on next week. And like I said, we'll delve more into the science of that at that time. We'll also, at the end, kind of try to pull it all together and just have some closing thoughts about how do we reconcile our scientific thoughts and our interest in our faith. So just to introduce me, I'm your note taker, okay? I'll spend a lot of the time today telling you about some really special scientists who've made landmark studies. Oh, okay. Let's see how we do that. Is that better? All right. Okay, sorry about that. As I said, I'm going to be telling you about some really remarkable scientists and studies. I'm not one of those. I have not studied near-death experiences, and I'd like you to think of me as a note-taker who, through doing anesthesia and working in a multidisciplinary pain clinic, I have experienced some of the other side of things people describe about this phenomenon. And so think of it as a journey. In terms of my biases, I was raised Catholic. Probably for at least half of my life, I would describe myself as an agnostic. And then after a while, came back to become a practicing Catholic. And so that's my perspective of how I look at the things that I'm going to describe. So first, what is a near-death experience? Well, if you look online, people will tell you that near-death experiences have existed since actually the time of Plato. And that's kind of true, but kind of not true. There's a lot of writings that describe people who had a sensation that their soul was leaving the body. And they would give stories, sometimes in mythic form, sometimes just narrative forms. And again, this can go back to not only the time of Plato, but in the Middle Ages, we've had experiences. We can also find experiences in military accounts, people or soldiers who have had that same experience of being in battle and all of a sudden entering a different realm. We also have various accounts throughout the Middle Ages. And the common factor of these is it tends to involve a separation of a person's perception from their body. Okay. Let me change gears. How about that? Okay, I'm really sorry. Okay. All right. The common factor, as I was saying, is that if we go back to even accounts that go back 2,300 years, we'll find people describing an experience where they're ill and there seems to be a separation from their awareness and their consciousness and their body. But the reports are fairly vague, and sometimes they're expressed in stories, sometimes they're expressed in myth. The common factor that we see in these is, number one, that separation from the body, and there also seems to be a feeling that they're in a different realm than the one that they had just left. So probably one of the best experts on this experience is a historian who's named Gregory Sushan, and he's written a couple of books on that topic. He's written a book here, Near-Death Experiences in Ancient Civilizations. He also looked at them in the Native American culture. And what he found is that we had a lot of similar experiences across cultures, so that the people in the Indian cultures and the people from ancient times in ancient Greece and the Middle Ages had common experiences, common themes. And he outlines this in his book. So some of the things that he talks about is he talks about this sense of leaving the body, traveling to another world or dimension, entering darkness, encountering a realm of light. exactly what seems to be described when they say is that there's an encounter with the light, not only a very bright and encountering light, but somehow there's an interaction with the light. There's a unification or transformation with the divine, meeting deceased relatives, encountering a barrier, and then the return to the body. So these traits seem to show up again and again throughout his accounts. Now, our first medical description occurred in 1766 by a military physician, and it's described here. At that time, French soldiers, the medicine was practiced in a different way, and one of the therapies is that they would drain blood from a patient who was ill. And the feeling was that this would purge them of something malicious in their blood, and this would help them heal. And so there was a patient that they were working on who became unconscious after a series of bloodletting and was unconscious for more than a couple of days. They thought he was dead, and then when he came back, he gave a very interesting experience that's notated in this French medical journal. His account actually said that he described it as a pure and extreme light, clear memory of the event, and again a quote, never a nicer moment. Now by this time, when we were looking at this, there was actually a scale that we're going to talk about in a second to evaluate how common these experiences were. It's called the Grayson scale. And I'm going to just leave that for now because we'll be talking about it in a second. So now we're going to go into the 20th century, and it's the 1970s, and we have writings actually from Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Maybe some of you are familiar with Dr. Kubler-Ross's work. She gave some seminal work on the process of grief, where she talks about the 5 stages of grief. And she's really a remarkable woman. Born in Switzerland, she describes always wanting to be a doctor, actually ran away from home to study because that was just not something that was open to her at the time. And then she came of age in her 20s during World War II. She said that one of the things that profoundly affected her was to visit a Polish concentration camp where she was able to see the writings on the wall of people who were about to die. And this inspired her to take an interest in dying and death and grieving. She did her psychiatric studies and then came over to the United States, earned her medical degree, and became practicing psychiatry. She's best known for taking accounts of dying people. And there's an interesting video where she says, people hated me because they thought I was taking advantage, but all I wanted to do was just sit and listen to their stories. And if you watch her interact by video, there's somewhere available with some of the patients, it's really a very compelling and moving thing. So she's trying to tell this to medical students because now she's on faculty. I believe it was in Arizona, I think, and she's describing the stages of grief and some of the work that she's done with patients. And she invites somebody who she interacted with just a few weeks before up to the stage, and they talk about leaving their body. And afterwards, it was clear from her presentation that she felt this was a very real experience. And she faced a lot of pushback for this. People said, aren't you going to call this an hallucination? This is obviously an hallucination. And she just didn't do it. And so this did 2 things. Number one,
it inspired her to do her own investigation. And number two, we'll mention that when she published her work on dying and death, describe the 5 stages of grief, there was actually an additional chapter to that book that talked about near-death experiences, and the publishers told her, we should leave that out because that's going to make you feel like you're too far off stream and people won't accept what you're saying. And so she did. She left that last chapter out of the book, but she decided to follow the stories of about 100 patients, and she made a list. So this is Elizabeth's list of what she encountered in about 100 of her patients. They're all fully aware of shedding their physical body in death. As we understand it in scientific language, death does not really exist. There's no time or distance. We may be trying to communicate with those that we can leave behind, but soon realize they can neither see or hear us. And then we became aware that our departed loved ones are awaiting us on the other side. Going on, he says, we may travel through a tunnel, notice the similarities here, pass through a gate, cross a bridge, travel through something else that's familiar to us. At the end of this journey, we will be embraced by an indescribably loving light. And if we are meant to return, we are permitted to see this light only briefly. We'll be shown our life from the first day to the last day, and we'll re-experience every thought we had, every deed we did, and every word we spoke. And many of our patients are not always grateful when their butterfly is squashed back into the cocoon. What did she mean by that? One of the things that she was particularly drawn to was working with children, and she found that it was helpful when she was working with a child with a terminal experience to describe the transformation of death as a butterfly metamorphosing from a cocoon into a brand new, beautiful species. So the thing that was interesting about this is this was what we call a prospective observational study. In other words, it wasn't really a study, but she was taking notes and she was taking a series going forward. So one of the criticisms that people would level is they'd say, well, you have somebody's anecdote from 22 years ago and maybe you have somebody from the 17th century, but these are all retrospective views. But this was all drawn from her own practice. It was very informal. And she got a lot of criticism for it. So this was the 1970s, and having lived through that period myself, that was a sure way to discredit yourself if you were in the scientific field. And people thought if anybody who must be talking about this must believe in ghosts. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was very passionate and very convinced in what she saw. And this didn't help. And so people, again, they're very grateful. She's a groundbreaking scientist, but she was very controversial at the time. So now we enter a new era come 1975, where we look at the scientific examination. And this is where we're going to actually give near-death experiences a name. And we're going to approach it from a scientific point of view. So how is science done? I wanted to talk about that because a lot of people talk about the scientific method, but what exactly is that? When you're doing science, you follow a process, a very disciplined process. And the first thing that you do is you observe the world. The better you can observe the world, the more profound your science will be. It's described that when Einstein was coming up with his theory of relativity, he was in a train station and he noticed that the pitch of a train, the sound coming from a train, changed as it went from behind him to ahead of him. An example of just somebody's observation leading to science. And then once you have an observation, the trick is to find something that you can measure. This is going to be a problem for us with NDEs because how do we measure this experience? Then you want to formulate something that you can test. You want to say, if I do this, I'm either going to have A or B. And you try your hardest to disprove the one that you think is going to be the real result. And then you publish your results, no matter what they are. That's the risk of science. You can spend years pursuing something to find out that you're wrong. But then you hope to have commonality in science. Somebody will repeat your study, or somebody will add to your study. So in a way, science is much like a jigsaw puzzle. My daughter is a big jigsaw puzzle fan. You notice that you start with something like this, and as the pieces fit together, piece by piece, relating to each other, you eventually can formulate a picture of the world. So Raymond Moody came along. Raymond had two interests. In 1975, he was a physician, he was a psychiatrist, and he also had a PhD in philosophy. He was very drawn to philosophical problems, but he thought, if I could apply the scientific method to near-death experiences, we'll learn more. And so the first thing he did was he defined the term, and he wrote a groundbreaking book after observing, I believe it's 150 reports of near-death experiences. And he was doing the same thing. He was looking for common themes. And he found that he was able to identify 10 major characteristics among these reports. And we're going to look at them in just a second. Matter of fact, let me just look at it now, and then I'll come back to that slide. Now take a look at what he found. He found in his 150 reports, again, he's drawing from history now, so this isn't perspective, but he's drawing. People, number one, the experience is hard to describe. It's ineffable. It's ineffable. They're leaving one is dead from the spectators, he's learning that one is dead from spectators and doctors. So they may watch their own resuscitation, and it may be a surprise to them that they're not alive. Pain is replaced by a pleasant sensation and a peace. Healing or hearing a dark, disturbing noise or pleasant, unearthly music. Traveling through a dark tunnel. And then once again, we find one outside the body in this being of light, another common theme. Panoramic review of one's life, arriving at a boundary, frontier, or a point of no return, and then returning to one's body after an earthly life. So once again, Raymond Moody, his book was translated into several languages. It was an international bestseller. It appealed to people who found something true in it. He was highly criticized later on in the scientific community. People claimed that his events could have come from hallucinations, from the effects of anesthesia, or the altered chemistry of a dying brain. So yes, as I promised, we'll be looking at that next week to test that hypothesis. Now, about that time, there was another scientist, Kenneth Ring, who added this. He expanded to 150 people, and looking at him, he decided, I'm going to do my own independent investigation. And he was in Connecticut, and look at the things that he found. He interviewed 102 patients close to death in Connecticut hospitals. 40% had a near-death experience. People didn't want to tell others that they had a near-death experience. As a matter of fact, in one of the accounts, a patient said that they woke up and wanted to relay this to the nurse in, I believe it was an Army hospital, and they were starting to describe being outside of his body. And the nurse said, you better put a lid on that or we're going to call psychiatry. People were embarrassed to tell their families and friends because they thought they wouldn't be taken seriously. So Ring went to these accounts of dying people, kind of similar to Kubler-Ross, but he did this in a much more precise scientific way. And again, 40% had near-death experiences. It had equal frequency among religious and non-religious patients. Most people became more spiritual after the event, and the common characteristics existed among reports, and he said NDEs, or near-death experiences, are a common, legitimate event. And this was a step too, because now we're having multiple verifications across time and cultures, and it's getting hard to deny that they're just hallucinations. The 5 characteristics that he found, again we can see the commonality: peace, body separation, entering darkness, seeing the light, and entering another realm of existence through that light. Now we come up to almost the 21st century. It's the 90s, and there's a physician who is still alive today. He's a professor emeritus, but his name's Bruce Grayson, and he's probably done the most extensive work with NDEs to date. Grayson reviewed again over 1,000 near-death experiences over 5 decades. Published over 450, he's had over 450 citations to his work, which is a way of saying people thought enough of his work that they're going to quote them in the references of their own studies. And he also developed a 16-point Grayson scale for evaluating NDEs. So if you remember when we talked early on about the French physician, they took the Grayson scale that he had here, and they took this historical event and they said, let's see how it matches up to Grayson. And Grayson went to the work of Moody, he went to Ring's work, and put together these characteristics. What are the common characteristics on a scale? And they found that account back then actually did register as an NDE on the Grayson scale. But this scale has been used to study the phenomenon of near-death experiences. Let's look at his observations. So first, here's his definition. He made a new definition which is used today, and this is the most precise definition. He says a near-death experience is an intensely vivid, often life-transforming experience, many of which occur under extreme physiological conditions, in which no awareness or sensory experiences should be possible, according to prevailing views in neuroscience. And once again, I've highlighted in red, all of these have been noted in the past by other investigators. The tunnel, the light. Here are things that struck him as a psychiatrist. He said, as a psychiatrist, I know how hard it is to change people's behavior. It's really hard. The remarkable thing about near-death experiences is that most of them have an effect on their life going forward. This doesn't happen when somebody takes LSD reliably. It doesn't happen when a patient or when a person has an hallucination, not characteristically. But this was a common thing, and he said, what is it about this experience? Not only are they life-changing, but they're very vivid. So if you have a person who's out of it for some other reason, they may not be able to describe it, or they may talk about being out of their body. But there was something very special about what he discovered with the Grayson scale. After doing several studies, he was able to identify a narrative, which I'm going to skip ahead here and come back to, that shows that there's a process. In other words, the near-death experience is a process. In all of these accounts, you start with the separation of the body. You start with the travel. You start with the light. You have the encounter, and then you come back. They differ among cultures, so an American Indian is going to describe it differently than a Southeast Asian man or woman would, or a Western person would describe. but there is still this temporal sequence. And we're going to talk about that again in a moment, but there's a sequence over time, which leads us to believe that maybe this isn't a random hallucination. Because when you study hallucinations, you realize that you don't have this degree of commonality, and they're not really vivid. I'll give you an example. I interact with a person down at the university who's undergoing ketamine infusions. And ketamine is one of the drugs that have been purported to mimic near-death experiences. And I ask her what it feels like. And she says, I just feel like I'm in a bubble outside of my body. I say, do you like that experience? No, I don't like it. Do you look forward to it? Yes, I look forward to it because it gets me out of pain. Okay. Has it changed your life? No. So trying not to lead the conversation, I've heard variations of this in the limited number of people that I've given ketamine infusions to. Very few people enjoy it. They do enjoy the pain relief that they get from it. But these are experiences where some remarkable things happen. For example, what they call veridical experiences. A veridical experience means you see something that should be impossible. And I'll give you two examples that I think are really mind-blowing. One happened in the midst of surgery when a patient was placed on heart-lung bypass for cardiac surgery. And because they were operating on the heart, they needed to stop the heart to perform surgery. So there's no circulation going to the brain. The blood is taken outside of the body and circulated through a machine that oxygenates it and keeps it in a condition where it can be re-entered. A patient underwent this procedure, and when the doctor followed up 10 days later on his rounds, he began to tell him things about the surgery that should not be possible. Number one, he said he noticed a bunch of notes being stuck to the computer, and he had no way of knowing that, but during surgery, many times you don't want to be interrupted, and so a scrub nurse would come in and put a note that would say, call Dr. Samuelson, or the labs are in, and she put them on sticky notes in succession so that at the end of surgery he could take them, leave, and read them and address them. The other thing that's interesting about this is that during anesthesia, the very first thing you do is you tape the eyes to protect the eyes, and you wrap the head, and so you can't really hear that well, you can't really see that well. Now, critics have said sometimes, well, perhaps they heard just enough in the OR that they could reconstruct a fantasy that was pretty close, maybe like a lucky guess. So there's yet another physician, Michael Sabon's his name, who was a cardiologist, and he had noticed his patients also. He had some disturbing experiences that he couldn't explain from patients like this. And so Sabon did a test. He looked at the experiences of people who reported NDEs, near-death experiences, and he found that they were all vivid. And he looked at these veridical experiences and he tried to match them up. And he found that almost with a 90% accuracy, the things that the people were reporting matched information that he was able to gather from the operating room staff or the physicians. So how can people or patients that should not have the capacity, they're not conscious, but they shouldn't have any ability to sense, fantasize something that is coincidentally true on the outside? So his test is he went to other cardiac patients who did not report a near-death experience, and he said, I'd like you to do a little experiment here. Can you imagine what would happen if you died on the operating room table, what would you have seen? And he found that about 80% of the time, these patients who may have been through multiple surgeries had some sort of very significant error. The accuracy wasn't there. And so there is a difference between near-death experiences and some of these other experiences. And then just one other experience, Dr. Grayson, who we just described, he was an intern and said it was his first week of residency, and he said, I was trying very hard to look like I knew more than I really did. And anybody who's gone through medical training knows exactly what that feels like. And somebody comes in who's just overdosed on antidepressants, and they're in a coma. They're in a deep coma, so everything about them suggests that there's no way this person is being able to perceive anything. So before he was called to look at this patient, he was in the cafeteria and he got a spot on his tie when he was eating spaghetti. So he's embarrassed because he's in his first week on the hospital staff. So he covers up with his white coat the tie and goes in and he sees the patient. And then the patient had a friend who was describing some of the events, what might have led up to her suicide, and he met with the friend later and talked to her and described her experiences. And so 3 days later, he's doing rounds, and now the patient is conscious. The patient's conscious, and he begins talking to her, and she said that, he said, I spoke to your friend. She says, yes, I know. And she also said, and that was a nasty stain that you had on your tie. And that really freaked him out. And he said there's no way anybody could have known that. That's actually what inspired him to look into near-death experiences many, many years ago when he was beginning his medical training. So that's an example of a veridical experience, all of those, where there's some sort of verification outside of their experience that link our realm to whatever the experience is. Okay, so today, and it's kind of a segue into what we'll be talking about next week, is Sam Parnia. Sam Parnia is a specialist at New York Langone. He's published a couple of books. One is called Lucid Dying and Chasing After Death. And he also created a study called the AWARE study. And Parnia's impetus as a scientist, he said, I wanted to find this even further. Because if we're talking about near-death experiences, what is death? Well, the common pathway is cardiac arrest, when your heart stops. When your heart stops, within 3 to 4 minutes, within about 30 to 60 seconds, you lose consciousness, but cells begin to die very quickly. And within about 4 to 6 minutes, that cellular deterioration in the brain occurs, and then at 10 minutes, it starts to be irretrievable. Parnia was very interested, and it still is, in resuscitation techniques in which this period can be prolonged. And he's noticed that there's evidence of people having near-death experiences, people having veridical experiences, conscious experiences after cardiac arrest. And his focus of his research is to actually study with anesthetic monitors and with the monitors an emergency room physician might use to see what their physical state is. Because if a brain is dying or dead, they should not be able to perceive, and if they do perceive, they shouldn't have vivid recall. So this is where Sam Parnia is at, and again, if he looks at some of the things that he's noted in his research, as he said, the recalled experiences of death that he describes are associated with an event that would lead to death without timely intervention. So he's saying, I'm just interested in the people that are really on death's door. And he said they're very definitely unique from drug experiences, dreams, delusions, and delirium. And it's this paradoxical lucidity. Why do you have these experiences in a brain that does not have circulation? Or if it's having circulation, it's at different times in different places. So we'll spend a lot of, we'll look at this further next week, but I do want to kind of sum up this topic. We said, how do we know that these experiences are not hallucinations? How do we know that they're not just the effect of drugs? And by now, we have thousands of near-death experiences that all have these common effects. Even as a scientist, you have to look at that and say, how is it that they're so similar across time and different circumstances? So if we were to make a table to compare hallucinations and near-death experiences, it would look something like this. For hallucinations, they tend to be disorderly events with hazy visions. They're generally not detailed. By contrast, the near-death experiences are often orderly events with clear perceptions. They leave their subjects feeling disturbed and agitated. And again, this is particularly true with some of the drugs that I mentioned. As a matter of fact, the drug ketamine, when we give it in anesthesia, we typically co-administer it with another drug so that they forget that experience, because when you give just ketamine, many people find it's a very unpleasant experience, and it's a disconnected, disorienting experience. It has little noteworthy effect on the long-term effect of the lives of people, whereas these are often inspiring the subjects to be more purposeful and more spiritual in their beliefs and their lifestyle. Okay, so some closing observations. Skepticism remains today about near-death experiences. And we're getting to the point, however, where it's really harder and harder for the skeptics not to acknowledge what is happening. Now, that doesn't mean it's a proof of life after death. It doesn't mean that it's a proof of God. A proof is a very strong, specific word. But there seems to be this reluctance to acknowledge any existence outside of our bodies, which is, the term is materialism. And I put a slide up here of, this is taken from Ulysses, and this is a myth, a Greek myth that goes back before the time of Christ. And he was going through the strait where he had to encounter sirens. Sirens were mythical angels in this myth that had such beautiful voices that it would allure sailors to their death. And so what he did is he was still drawn. He wanted to hear the voices of the sirens. So in the myth, he lashed himself to the mast of the ship because as a captain, he had to guide the ship. And so he's tied to the mast of the ship, and he had the rowers plug their ears with wax. And so there's a see, he's looking here and he's being tempted by the sirens. Interestingly enough, Parnia published another study last year in the journal Resuscitation, a very serious scholarly journal, that was talking about the existence of brain waves that suggested very specific high-level energy after cardiac arrest. And he gave us justification for it, and there was another scientist who wrote in and he said, you don't have any proof of that. You can't, there's no evidence to suggest that that's anything more than hallucination. And he ended where he said, these stories are very compelling, but I have lashed myself to the mast of evidence-based science, and keep my focus on what I know to be right and true. So you will find skeptics, and scientists are human beings just like the rest of us, and sometimes it's hard to take a leap forward from the familiar. One of the things that Grayson says, he says, describing a near-death experience is a little like having 3 blind men encounter an elephant for the first time. And so the first one feels the trunk, and he says, I know what this is. It's a snake, because it moves, and because of the shape, it has to be a snake. The other person says, no, it has to be the branch of a tree, because it's hard and it's rigid, it's not moving. And then yet another person says, no, this is a tree because I can feel the stump of the tree. And he says, in science, when you narrow your focus down, which you have to do for the scientific method, you tend to see just one thing, and the problem is trying to draw it all together. And this is what he says we're facing now in the study of near-death experiences. Sometimes you have to look at things a different way to realize that you can be describing the same thing. So for example, could it be that, yes, you can describe chemical changes in the brain that are consistent with the time of death that show a burst of activity? Could it be that there's other features that we can describe scientifically? Does this mean that the experience is not true? So first, let's look at this idea. Could something have a scientific explanation as well as an experiential explanation? And this is a nice little drawing. Maybe you've seen it before. Is this a duck or a rabbit? Look in this direction, you're going to see a duck. Look in this direction, and you see a rabbit. The point of this is that the way we look at things will often determine what we see. So if we look at these experiences as a scientist, we may be losing the whole picture. If we look at this as somebody with faith alone, we may be losing the whole picture. So it's kind of like what I call the KISS test. Imagine the best kiss, the most memorable kiss you've ever had in your life. And it doesn't have to be a passionate kiss between lovers. It can be a kiss maybe of a parent on a child's forehead. It could be a kiss of goodbye. But think of the experience of what that kiss conveyed. Now, as a scientist, I could tell you the lips are heavily innervated with sensory neurons, and they connect to the brain in a place called the pleasure center, and they release a hormone called oxytocin, which tends to bind people and create bonding activities among human beings. And that would be true. And if we put a catheter in each one of you and measure it in your blood, we'd probably find, if you were to go through that experience of a kiss, we'd find oxytocin, and we can verify all that. But if we looked at your experience, you might say, well, that's just your experience, and you saw your grandmother, but you didn't see anybody, and you saw a light, but you didn't see a light. And they're going to see all of this is just random. There's no evidence to suggest. Well, maybe we're just not looking for it. So next week we'll kind of pick up on some of the things that we talked about, but today I just wanted to introduce you to the field of near-death experience studies, to show you that it's a legitimate field, that these are experiences that have been experienced by human beings across time and across cultures. We're going to take another closer look at what happens in the dying brain next week, because one of the theories is that near-death experiences can be explained by oxygen deprivation or an overload of carbon dioxide. If you're interested in science, we're going to talk about that on a more deeper level. And then we'll also come back to some of these other questions, and we'll kind of end up with what seems to be the leading question, not only now in science, one of the leading questions in neuroscience, but also in faith. Is consciousness something that is endowed without? Does it exist outside of our bodies? Are we part of something more than ourselves? Or is consciousness like an electric field that is just generated by neurons in a living animal or a human being, and when the blood flow stops and the electrical field stops, it's extinguished? So that's the tension, and if we look closer into the science, I think you'll find that it's very interesting, and again, it's going to be harder to stick to that materialistic view that seems to have prevailed for most of the 20th century. All right, that's all I have. Thank you. Please, if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, experiences to share, I'd love. Yes, sir, please.
Comment on two of them. One of the ladies, she was a psychiatrist, a therapist, but she said that there was one study done with several people who had been blind from birth, and they were able to account things and describe things that it would be impossible because they had never seen before. And but they were consistent in terms of their experience. And the other question I have for you, you mentioned about the panoramic view, but I'm not sure if I missed it, but a lot of people said that in terms of that view, there's somebody with them that's helping them, or they experience a figure, whether it be a Christ-like or a relative or somebody they knew, that sort of helps them in terms of what they're experiencing. Have you, in your research or in your studies, have you come across that?
The reverberation is getting to me, so I think you're asking, are there other people who have been present with the person who is dying who could collaborate what they've said? Who's been, oh, that's actually very fascinating. One of the characteristics that Grayson found in his research that really led him to accept the validity of near-death experiences is the encounter with deceased relatives. And one could imagine, if you know that a person's dead, you might fantasize, you know, like my father died at a very young age, and to think of meeting him would be something I could fantasize about. But the thing that really was an eye-opener to him were accounts of people who encountered individuals that they didn't know had died. So the story that comes to mind is something he describes, where he says he took care of a patient who had come in, and he was in the intensive care unit, and he was rehabilitating after a long period of coma. And he met a nurse who was, he developed a liking for, and he said he was kind of flirtatious with the nurse. And she was a young woman, 20, 21 years old. And she mentioned that she was going away because she was attending a birthday celebration. It was her birthday. And that's all he knew. He said that he had an experience where the nurse came back and said, if you see my parents, I want to apologize, number one, for crashing the car, and number two, that everything will be all right. So 2 days later, I think it's a day or two later, some of the other nursing staff come in, and he said, well, where is, what the nurse was? He said, well, some terrible news that she passed on, and she perished in a motor vehicle accident over the weekend. So that's one example of encountering a person on the other side who is dead and they don't know about. Another experience Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talks about is she was caring for a family who had all perished over a holiday, and a little girl was there, and her brother was in the burn unit, and her parents had died. And she said that she was talking to the girl and trying to comfort her, and when she left the room, before she left the room, she said that she had an apparition where she encountered her brother. At the later, when she left and went out to the ward, she said that the nurses told her, says, we have some sad news. Her brother just got a call, died about 10 minutes ago. And Dr. Ross said, I said something that I probably shouldn't have. Says, yes, I know. And, you know, again, back in that time, that's just a way to make it look like you're crazy. Those are two examples, but there are several examples, and I can give you a reference. There's a book called The Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, and it's by the group that Grayson put out. It's very scholarly, very academic, but it will cover many of these things in great detail, and I think you might find it interesting. Ask me later, and I'll try to give you a more specific reference.
The doctor had 5 things that occurred when when you have the near-death experience, and the third one I think was separation of the body. Okay.
Yes.
Is he saying that the soul leaves the body and then returns once you gain consciousness again?
The question is, does the soul leave the body and then return in a near-death experience?
That's what it said on the inscription up here.
Yes. So there's 2 ways to look at that, and I can describe some of the controversy about that. In the brain, we have a map of the body that's represented in the brain. So if you go and touch or stimulate certain areas of the very outer layer, the cortex, you might get a sensation in a part of your body. And people have thought that during the dying process or during a drug experience where these neural communications are altered, that you're not signaling between that part of the brain and what you're experiencing. And that's what creates this out-of-body experience. So for example, when you take peyote, chemical changes will occur, but they're temporary. And so that's how a person can have this. If you read these accounts, people say they feel like they're flying and they're out, and then they'll come back. So that's the one interpretation. But the second argument against that, could it be that the soul is leaving the body? I don't know how you can discount that when you look at theoretical experiences. If you have somebody who is describing an experience that's verified by somebody who was awake and conscious, it certainly suggests that there's some way to perceive when our body passes on. And a couple of interesting things, you talk about life-changing events. There's life-changing events among the scientists who've studied these, not all of them. But even Sam Parnia, who tries to avoid a religious interpretation of his data, said, I don't see how you can deny that consciousness can exist independent of the body. So that's what the debate is now. If you're religious, as I am, you will acknowledge a soul. If you're a materialist, you may track it up to altered neuronal physiology. Did that answer your question? Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
Has there been any study of EEG or MRI
Yes, the question is, have there been any studies with EEG or MRI? There have, and we're actually going to look at those next week, but just to kind of answer your question, I think precisely, with an EEG is an electroencephalogram. So what it is it's a way of detecting electrical currents in the brain, and there's a hierarchy of signals. In other words, if you're asleep and unconscious under anesthesia, you get these low waves that are kind of big. They're big and bounding waves. The more conscious you become, the smaller and more compact and intense these waves come. So the waves that I talked about first are called beta waves. The really intense waves are called gamma waves. Well, gamma waves are something that's associated either with by hyperconsciousness, I mean if you have somebody who's really concentrating, like a musician who's really playing a piece of music and concentrating on their music, or if you have someone who's a meditator, you'll see a lot of gamma activity. They've shown gamma activity in people who meditate, in people, they've actually found, I think, there's this group of, I want to say nuns, who they study them in prayer. So anyway, the idea is that the more intense this activity is, it tends to be associated with this high level electrical current in your brain. Okay, the challenge of near-death experiences is that when you die and you cut off the supply of oxygen and when you increase the supply of carbon dioxide, when you alter and cease, when blood flows to your brain has ceased, you shouldn't be getting activity. But there is activity, and not only is there activity, but there's gamma activity that occurs at that. Now, the one camp says, well, the reason that happens is that you have cellular death, and during the death of cells, all of the neurochemicals they're released in a process called apoptosis. You just have this sudden last hurrah where all of the energy is released, and then you die. So if a person does die and doesn't come back, we're never going to hear their near-death experience, their NDE story. So to answer your question, yes, EEG evidence shows that there is high-intensity electrical activity after cardiac arrest. And this is what led Parnia to put this together with NDEs and other people to say, this helps validate them. So that's the short answer. I'm interested in the comment. If you think. MRI, no, because, well, I'm not aware of it. If they've done it, the challenge of doing that is to get an MRI, you have to put somebody in an MRI tube, and during resuscitation, that's just not what happens. So by contrast, there have been people who have been monitored who, let's say, have had severe epilepsy or other disorders who might have monitors on. And these people have led to anecdotal reports. And then what Parnia has done is he's actually pre-monitored people who are terminally ill and captured their events. And so he has a whole body of work that examines that. So that I'm curious, just for my own information, would MRI give us another piece of information that we wouldn't get from EEG? Yeah. I heard you say studies in animals. They actually have studied animals, and they've picked up that last burst of energy during induced cardiac arrest in animals. And this is, again, when the people say, well, if it happens in animals, Needless to say, you can't always, these are really big leaps that the materialists are making. There's lots of instances where animal research does not translate into human research. And the other thing is that nobody really knows what that electrical activity means. So yes, we do see a burst of electrical activity. Does that mean they have an experience of meeting a dead relative or encountering a beam of light so intense and vivid that it changes their life? So that's the leap that the materialist would have to traverse to really prove it's nothing but a physiologic phenomenon.
I just wanted to make a quick comment, in that regard. That's the perfect topic then to talk about the integration between faith and science,
Yes.
because, it takes a leap of faith really to believe in a near-death experience, I think, but it's nice to kind of see the scientific, method being used here to say that this is a repeatable, remarkably consistent experience, which gives it, a bit of credibility from a scientific standpoint. The phrase that kept coming up to me from this talk was an indescribably loving light, and I've often heard when people describe what is God-like, light is often with this intense light that's love. And it made me think a little bit of Marian apparitions, and I don't know whether there's a correlation there, but they often talk about having an out-of-body experience, and scientific experiments are done on these children or people who have during an apparition, and they're having this out-of-body experience, and afterward they describe this love that nothing in the world ever satisfies them again. And I think you mentioned that some of these people will say it's a glimpse and it's life transforming, and so that a question I wrote down and you answered it is, well, what happens to them afterward? Do they become more faithful afterward? Do they start to go to church more? It'd be interesting to follow these people throughout their life and see what happens as a result, because a lot of the Marian apparition, people go on to become religious or have a life dedicated, because once you experience that and feel that, it's all you want, and so that speaks, I think, to the credibility of it, in cases. I mean, I'm sure some it could be real, some could be not, but it's the consistency.
Again, if I didn't, I'm going to try to comment. If I missed some of it, it's my own problem with that. But let me, this idea of a light has had several explanations over time. So at first people way back when said the reason you see a bright light is that your optic nerve is dying. And as it dies, there's a release of chemicals that stimulate the retina of your eye, and that's why you can have your eyes taped and you still see a bright light. This doesn't account for the experience of people who have had similar experiences where that's not occurred, like in drowning victims. But anyway, that was one explanation. The second explanation of this is that there was actually a scientific test that said you can stimulate different parts of the eye and get a sensation of a bright flash. But then the sequence that was described in Grayson and Parnia's work say that you go from the white light after you have the sensation of leaving your body. And it's part of a sequence. And how do you encounter that? That's one comment. The second thing is I've heard people say that maybe Paul, on the way to Emmaus, had an epileptic seizure. And he saw a bright light and he fell off his horse and he's incapacitated. How many epileptics do you recall from your practice who would be willing to completely change the course of their life and to face martyrdom because of their seizure? I can't answer that, but that's the thing is where Grayson as a psychiatrist says, I know how hard it is for people to change. Why is it that they become, on the whole, they become more spiritual and less interested in the world? And the other thing I forgot to mention, Kubler-Ross said in her study, not a single one of her patients retained their fear of death. And Grayson also said that the majority of people also lose their fear of death. So there are negative NDEs. By and large, most of them are positive. But yes, but that's...
Is there any official church teaching or document about NDEs?
Is there any official document or teaching by the church on NDEs? I'm not aware of any. Maybe somebody else here has. I'm not aware of any.
So the question of whether to go toward the light is still left unanswered. All right. Well, Dr. Saxon will be available after this to answer some more questions.
Sure.
We thank you for attending tonight. Maybe we'll just close with a quick prayer. So in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Father, we thank you for the chance to come together and for the gift of Dr. Saxon's speech tonight on how to integrate faith and science together. We thank you for creating the physical body to let us experience the world and giving us the faith to love you. Let us journey towards your light this Lent and be transformed from our own death and sin and body into your life. And we ask this in the Father's name, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. And we'll see you next Tuesday at 7 o'clock. Thank you.